and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. Today we're going to be talking about a fascinating subject. It's been ongoing since we started the radio show, and the concept today will be mythical floods. And the question and some of the information we're going to dive into are going to be, is there scientific evidence for such mythical floods, and what do we know about them? Going all the way back to the historical accounts. Now, we all know about the story of Atlantis. For those that may not be up to speed on what we know, Atlantis was also spelled Atlantis, like the Atlatl, and it was also called Atlantica. It's a legendary island in the Atlantic Ocean, lying west of the Straits of Gibraltar. Now, the principal sources for the legend are two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In the former, Plato describes how Egyptian priests, in conversation with the Athenian lawgiver Solon, described Atlantis as an island larger than Asia Minor and Libya combined, and situated just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now know today as the Straits of Gibraltar. And about 9,000 years before the birth of Solon, the priest said, Atlantis was a rich island whose powerful princes conquered many lands of the Mediterranean until they were finally defeated by the Athenians and the later allies. The Atlanteans eventually became wicked and impious, and their island was swallowed up by the sea as a result of earthquakes, not flooding. So that's kind of interesting, that they've been swallowed up by earthquakes and not flooding. And let's actually get over to some of the more detailed accounts here. Egyptian wisdom, Plato and Solon. And this is from the mid 4th century BCE. And we're going to start with an Egyptian priest's explanation of why Egyptian records are superior and have survived disasters, but Athenians remain young as a civilization. At this point, one of the priests, a very old man, said, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek." And on hearing this, Solon asked, "What do you mean by this saying?" Well, the priest replied, "You are young in soul, every one of you, for you possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from the old tradition, nor is your understanding gray with age. And this is the cause. There have been and there will be many and diverse destructions of humankind. The greatest destructions will be by fire and water, and the lesser ones by countless other means. For instance, you have a story about how Phaeton, son of Helios, yoked his father's chariot, and because he was unable to drive it along the course taken by his father, burned up all that was on the earth, and himself perished by a thunderbolt. That story, as it is told, has the form of a legend, but the truth of it lies in the occurrence of a shifting of the bodies in the heavens which move around the earth, and destruction of the things on the earth by and fierce fire, which recurs at very long intervals. At such times, all those dwelling on the mountains and in high and dry places suffer destruction, more than those who dwell near rivers or the sea, in our case, the Nile. Our Savior, in other ways, saves us also at such times from this disaster by rising high. But when, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with floodwaters, all the herdsmen and shepherds that are high in the mountains are saved. But those in the cities of your land are swept into the sea by the streams. Yet in our country, either in the past or now, the water does not pour down over the fields from above. On the contrary, it all tends naturally to well up from below. And for these reasons, what we preserve here is reckoned to be most ancient. And he's talking about Egypt there. The truth being that in every place where there is no excessive heat or cold to prevent it, there always exists some human stock, now more, now less in number. And if any event has occurred that is noble or great or in any conspicuous, whether taking place in your country or in ours or in some other place of which they've known by report, all such events are recorded since the old days and are preserved here in our Egyptian temples. Yet your people and the others are but newly equipped every time with the letters and all such arts as civilized cities require. And when, after the usual interval of years, like a plague, the flood from heaven comes sweeping down again upon your people, it leaves none of you but the unlettered and uncultured. So you become as young as ever once again, with no knowledge of all that has happened in old times in this land or in your own. Certainly the genealogies which you relate just now, Solon, concerning the people of your country are little better than children's tales. For in the first place, you remember but one flood, though many have occurred previously. Furthermore, you are ignorant of the fact that the best and most perfect group among men were born in the land where you now live. From them, both of yourself are sprung, and the whole of your existing city, out of some little seed that chanced to be left over. But this has escaped your notice, because for many generations the survivors died with no power to express themselves in writing. But in fact, there was a time, Solon, before the greatest destruction by water, when what is now called the city of Athens was the bravest in war and extremely well organized, in all other respects as well. It is said that it possessed the most splendid works of art and the noblest civic organizations of any people under heaven of which we have heard anything about. So this is an amazing account that we are now reading, which clearly shows that the Egyptians were aware of many floods, many destructions by fire, and he is now making an account of this and basically telling the Greeks, the Athenians, that they have been wiped out so many times they don't even remember any of these previous destructions. Upon hearing this, Solon said that he was amazed and with the utmost enthusiasm asked the priest to recount for him in order and exactly all the facts about those citizens of old. The priest then said, "I will gladly tell you the story, Solon, both for your own sake and for the sake of your city. But most of all, I will tell it for the sake of the goddess who has adopted for her own both your land and our land and has nurtured and trained them. Your city was founded first when she had received the seed from you from Ge and Hephaestus, and 1,000 years later ours was founded. The duration of our civilization, as set down in our sacred writings, is 8,000 years." Now, this conversation is taking place quite some time ago. And so the civilization he is talking about is began at the end of the Younger Dryas 11,500 years ago. Pretty amazing. Now, regarding the citizens who lived 9,000 years ago then, I will briefly outline to you some of their laws and the most excellent achievements. The full account in precise order and detail we will go through later at our leisure, taking the actual writings. So this is amazing. The priest is well aware of the history of the Atlanteans in what we call pre-flood, but in the account of the destruction of Atlantis, the conclusion is that Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes, not by floods. About 9,000 years before the birth of Solon, the priest said, Atlantis was a rich island whose powerful princes conquered many lands. The Atlanteans eventually became wicked and impious, and their island was swallowed up by the sea. So that term makes you think that it's a flood, but it says swallowed up by the sea as a result of earthquakes, which is more likely that the island of Atlantis itself sank into the ocean because of some cataclysmic geophysical event. Now, the position of Atlantis, which is now the modern-day Azores, is on the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is a site of volcanism that stretches from the north to the South Pole, essentially, right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it is on this divergent plate boundary where huge amounts of volcanic activity occur. And if, for some reason, let's say, it were to ramp up in speed, well, then an entire continent could subside into the ocean. And it would certainly appear to be a flood. Now, Atlantis is depicted in an engraving by Athanasius Kircher. And the title of the painting is Mundus Subterraneus from 1664, which shows the north on the bottom of the map and the South Pole on the top, which puts Africa and Spain and Portugal on the left side of the map instead of the right side. It's very bizarre. But you could see America, you could see Africa, you could see the Straits of Gibraltar, and directly in front of the Straits of Gibraltar is this giant continent of Atlantis. So that's kind of interesting there. Now, in this island of Atlantis, there existed a confederation of kings with great and marvelous power who held sway over all of the island, over many other islands, and over other parts of the continent. Moreover, of the lands here within the straits, they ruled over Libya as far as Egypt, and over Europe as far as Tuscany. So this host, being all gathered together, made an attempt one time to enslave by one single military campaign both your country and ours. So it appears as if the Atlanteans had a huge military and they were trying to subjugate the entire planet. It says they made an attempt one time to enslave by one single military campaign both your country and ours, as well as the whole of the territory within the straits at that time. Solon, your city displayed its courage and might in the view of the whole world, for it stood preeminent above all in bravery and military skill, acting partly as a leader of the Greeks and partly standing alone by itself when deserted by all others and after encountering the deadliest perils. It defeated the invaders and raised a trophy. By this action, it saved from slavery those who were not yet enslaved, and all the rest of us who dwelt within the bounds of Hercules. It set free without hesitation. But at a later time, there occurred ominous earthquakes and floods, One grievous day and night, the whole group of your warriors was swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. And as a result, the ocean at that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked up by the shoal mud, which is the land created as it settled down. Well, the shoal mud has since washed away, and what we are left with is a few islands poking up called the Azores. And I will continue with the final few paragraphs of the interaction. You have heard now, Socrates, in brief outline, the account given by the elder Critias of what he heard from Solon. When you were speaking yesterday about the city and its citizens you were describing, I was amazed as I called to mind the facts I am now relating, reflecting what a strange piece of fortune it was that your description coincided so exactly, for the most part, with Solon's account. But I chose not to speak right away, because my recollections of his account was not sufficiently clear due to the passing of time. So I decided that I should not relate it until I had first gone over it all carefully in my own mind. And consequently, I readily consented to the theme you proposed yesterday, since I thought that we should be reasonably well provided for the task of supplying a satisfactory speech, which is always the greatest task. So it was that, as Hermocrates has said, the moment I left your place yesterday, I began to relate to them the story as I recollected it. And after I parted from them, I pondered it over during the night and recovered, as I may say, the whole story. It is really amazing how the lessons of one's childhood grip the mind, as the saying is. For myself, I do not know whether I could recall everything that I heard yesterday. Yet as to the account I heard such a long time ago, I should be immensely surprised if a single detail of it has escaped me. And then the greatest pleasure and amusement in hearing it, and the old man was eager to tell me, since I kept questioning him repeatedly. So the story is now stamped firmly on my mind, like the designs that used to heat to make indelible paintings. Moreover, immediately after daybreak, I related the same story to our friends here, so they might share in my rich provisions of speech. So this is the account with Plato and Timaeus the camera off there, on what they know about Atlantis. So pretty fascinating stuff there. And what it appears as if is going on here is the Atlanteans once controlled the entire Earth, meaning the Atlantic Empire. And so is the flood in the Bible the destruction of Atlantis? Well, probably not, because in the account here with the Egyptian priests, they are almost laughing at the Greeks and the Athenians who think that there was only one flood. And they say, quite obviously, that there have been numerous floods, and you just don't remember because it killed all of the people capable of remembering. And the only people left were so timid and weak and uneducated, they were incapable of figuring out a means to keep the story going. Now, we did do an entire show on the mythical flood of Noah. Most people are familiar with the story of Noah and his ark. And they typically take two extreme positions. It's either true or it's a myth. Well, why can't a myth also be true? That's my question. Political agendas aside, what if the answer is somewhere in between? Now, recent scientific evidence and the discovery in the 1990s of a massive meteor crater on the floor of the Indian Ocean can very well be the event the Noah story and other myths are based on. Now, what we do know about recent comet or meteor explosions is that they happen often. On February 15th in 2013, in Chelyabinsk, Russia, a meteor exploded over this city, shattering windows across the region. We saw it on TV and on YouTube. And even at 100 kilometers away, the flash was brighter than the sun. And some witnesses claim to have felt heat from the fireball. 1,500 people were injured. Estimated to have an explosive force of 500 kilotons, this was 25 times the power of the Hiroshima nuclear blast. It was estimated to have a mass of 1,200 tons and a diameter of just 60 feet, perhaps the weight of a cargo ship or a small destroyer. Fortunately, the object discharged with the Earth at a height of 18 to 19 miles above the surface. We also know on June 30th, 1908, another super bolide explosion occurred in Tunguska, near central Siberia. While information is sketchy, the explosion of Tunguska occurred 3 to 6 miles high. It destroyed through blast and fire 770 square miles of forest and left no crater. This object has been estimated to be from 200 to 600 feet in diameter. Much bigger than the Chelyabinsk bolide. So we know these things. We've seen two big ones come in the last 100 years. But let's talk about Burckle Crater. Burckle Crater is even bigger. It's located in the southern Indian Ocean between Madagascar and Australia, and the crater is 18 miles wide. That's huge. It's 25 times the size of Arizona's Meteor Crater. And Burckle Crater is also more than 2 miles deep, at 12,500 foot deep. Now, the Holocene Impact Working Group believes the impact occurred sometime between 2800 and 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago. Perfect timing for the flood of Noah. And some claim the impact was responsible for huge chevron dunes in Australia and Madagascar. We've showed those on previous podcasts, so we won't get into that. But Bruce Mass, an environmental archaeologist at Los Alamos National Labs, believes that around 5,000 years ago, a 1 to 3 mile wide ball of rock swung around the sun and smashed into the ocean off the coast of Madagascar. And the ensuing cataclysm sent a series of 600-foot high tsunamis crashing around the world's coastlines and injected plumes of superheated water vapor and aerosol particles into the atmosphere. Within hours, the infusion of heat and moisture blasted its way into the jet streams and spawned super hurricanes that pummeled the other side of the planet. This lasted for about a week. Material ejected into the atmosphere plunged the world into darkness. All told, up to 80% of the world's population may have perished, making it the single most lethal event in human history. Now, many people question the size of the object that Bruce Mass claims. It could have just been a mile wide because the Yucatan strike, alleged to have killed the dinosaurs, was 5 to 6 miles wide. That's a big, big rock. And so there are lots of myths that also correspond to this, not just the flood of Noah. In the Gilgamesh epic, the hero of Mesopotamia saw a pillar of black smoke on the horizon before the sky went dark for a week. Now, I wish he had said in the south, because this would corroborate the impact in the Indian Ocean. And according to Gilgamesh, afterward, a cyclone pummeled the Fertile Crescent and caused a massive flood. Myths recounted in indigenous South American cultures also tell of a great flood. Note that the steam column in the Indian Ocean, described by Mass. Oh, we'll get back to some of the science after the commercial break. So stay tuned for more Boom.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons. There are...
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of Mythical Floods, Fact or Fiction, on Revolution Radio and our show, Cosmic Catastrophe. So we've gone over the accounts of Atlantis and the Egyptian priests and the fact that, well, The Egyptians knew of all of the catastrophes, apparently, thousands of years ago, and they were slightly mocking the Greeks because the Greeks had forgot. And the description is that there are two types of cosmic catastrophes. There are catastrophes by flooding and catastrophes by fire. And the priest recounted that the fiery catastrophes, anyone living in dry areas or up on the mountains, all perished. People by rivers made it. And the flood catastrophes, most of the civilization was washed away because they all lived by the rivers and they were destroyed in the deluge. And the sheep herders up on the mountains, yes, those are the ones that survived. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, we're going to go over some of the science that may corroborate this. And let's dive right into it, shall we? So we were talking about the flood myths. Now, among the 175 flood myths, there are two of particular interest. There's a Hindu myth, which describes an alignment of the 5 bright planets that has happened only once in the last 5,000 years, according to computer simulations. And that would put it at the time of the Berkel crater impact. And there's also a Chinese story that mentions the Great Flood occurring at the end of the reign of the Empress Nuwa. And you cross-check historical records with astronomical data, you can come up with a specific date for Noah's flood. And that is mind-blowing. And according to the date, Noah's flood happened May 10th, 2807 BC. Now that is amazing, which would be the date of the impact of Berkel crater. So you can either say Noah's flood or the impact of Berkel crater happened May 10th, 2807 BC. Now, if this is the correct date, and Berkel crater was about, a Berkel asteroid was about, or comet was a mile wide, the coast of modern Pakistan and Western India would have been devastated. In Madagascar, debris piled hundreds of feet high were deposited 4 miles inland, as corroborated by peer-reviewed science. And the scientist who did that work was Ted Bryant, a geomorphologist at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia. The wave in the paper was believed to be 600 feet high, and the chevrons were packed with deep ocean microfossils, which were dredged up by the tsunami and the impact. Dozens of chevron structures are located with Google Earth in Asia and Africa easily. So pretty amazing. Now let's talk about some more floods. We've all heard about the Great Missoula floods in the Pacific Northwest. Now, many of you might not know that the Great Missoula floods have nothing to do with the Younger Dryas event. That's kind of bizarre. So at the end of the last ice age, a finger of the Cordilleran ice sheet crept southward into the Idaho Panhandle. It formed a large ice dam that blocked the mouth of Clark Fork River and created a massive 2,000-foot deep lake containing more than 500 cubic miles of water. And this is Glacial Lake Missoula. It stretched eastward for 200 miles and contained more water than Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. When the highest of these ice dams failed, the lake water burst through, shooting out at a rate 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world. Let me repeat that. When the Glacial Lake Dam burst, it shot water out at a rate of 10 times the combined flow of all the rivers in the world. Now, this towering mass of water and ice literally shook the ground as it thundered towards the Pacific, stripping away hundreds of feet of soil and cutting deep canyons, which we now call coulees in this region, into the underlying bedrock. With flood speeds approaching 65 miles per hour, the lake would have drained in as little as 2 days. Now, over time, the Cordilleran ice sheet continued moving south and blocked the Clark Fork River again and again, recreating glacial Lake Missoula. And over approximately 2,500 years, the lake ice dam and flooding sequences was repeated many times, leaving a lasting mark on the landscape. Now, this is just one of the theories. There are now other theories. We do know that the Lake Missoula flood was one of the largest floods in Earth history. It's also referred to as the Spokane flood or the Brett's flood. It may be an analog for the Genesis flood, but as we've just determined, that is probably covered with Burkle Crater and the impact that happened 5,000 years ago. This is much earlier. The Lake Missoula flood occurred at the peak of the last ice age. So that puts it way back before the Younger Dryas event. And we talked about the volume. Now, the concept of the Lake Missoula flood has a controversial history based on geologic observations going back as far as 1923. J. Harlan Bretz postulated a gigantic flood in eastern Washington from an unknown source. And this is the beginning of the science. And then this started the storm of controversy that lasted for 4 decades. The idea of the Lake Missoula flood was rejected because it seemed too close to the biblical flood, according to Victor Baker. Bretz's flood theory was so despicable that even circular reasoning could be employed to erect alternative hypotheses. One cannot but be amazed at the spectacle of otherwise objective scientists twisting hypotheses to give a uniformitarian explanation to the channeled scablands. Undoubtedly, these men thought they were upholding the very framework of geology as it had to been established in the writings of Hutton, Lyell, and Agassiz. Now, Brett's outrageous hypothesis was vindicated in the 1960s when more than just a few geologists actually went out and examined the area. The evidence was obvious and overwhelming for great floods. Nevertheless, not just content with one gigantic flood, uniformitarian geologists could not help but postulate more than one. The Lake Missoula floods then became uniformitarian events. Yes. The tradition started with Bretz himself, who at age 70 returned for field work in eastern Washington and postulated possibly up to 7 floods. And up until 1980, most investigators postulated 1 or a few floods in that year. Richard Waite proposed a succession of about 40 Lake Missoula floods. His evidence was primarily based on a series of 40 rhythmites in Burlingame Canyon within the Walla Walla Valley of southeast Washington. This is located in a backwater basin that was inundated after the floodwater pounded behind a constriction at Wallula Gap and forming a lake of 250 meters deep. Waite postulated that each rhythmite was laid down by one Lake Missoula flood. He based his conclusion especially on the existence of a supposedly subaerial ash layer on top of the 13th rhythmite from the top. That's getting interesting, because we now have floods and volcanic eruptions happening at the same time. And in 1986, the number of floods jumped up to 90, based on 89 rhythmites separated by what are believed to be varves, which were discovered in the San Poil Valley in northeast Washington. Each rhythmite was related to one Lake Missoula flood, and a total of 3,000 varves were claimed, intermingled within the flood rhythmites. So the whole sequence of 90 Lake Missoula floods was thought to have occupied a period of about 3,000 years. This is more than 10 times too much time for deglacial phase of post-flood ice age based on melting equations over snow and ice during a cooler ice age climate. So this is where it gets interesting. Lately, more geologists are swinging full circle back to fewer floods, or even just one, including, I think, we'll get to that. So Lake Missoula flood, a single flood. There's a geologist, Gary Smith, who disputed some of the evidence used to argue that each rhythmite was a separate flood. Instead, he claimed that 2 to 9 rhythmites might make up each flood for a total of just 20 Lake Missoula floods. Now, this arbitrary grouping together of these rhythmites confuses the matter, especially since at any one location, each rhythmite is similar. Now, recently, a team of 8 investigators from the University of Alberta in Edmonton have reevaluated the field evidence for the number of floods and have concluded that there was only one flood from glacial Lake Missoula. Although they postulate that other floods from British Columbia carved the Grand Coulee, the later postulates has some merit and needs to be evaluated further. Shaw and others argue that the volcanic ash layer in the Burlingame Canyon was deposited underwater because the ash layer was intercalcated with silt and sand, which suggests the simultaneous deposition of both the ash and the suspension deposits. And this is a conclusion many have arrived to when examining the deposits. Here's a picture. I know you can't see it there. So Shaw et al. Provide further evidence at Burlingame Canyon and elsewhere along the flood path for just one gigantic flood. First, the rhythmites fine upwards from 2 centimeters to 10, more indicative of one flood that waned with time. So each rhythmite is changing size in a regular pattern. Rhythmites fine upwards. Second, minor scours are confined to the basal units. If each rhythmite were a separate flood, the scour should be all through the rhythmite. Third, unique clastic dikes, which look like sand and silt rhythmites, are cut through numerous beds and sometimes through the whole sequence of rhythmites, indicating that the dikes were formed under pressure, temporarily in excess of lithostatic pressure, and that most have formed after deposition of the entire sequence. Otherwise, each bed would have its own set of dikes, generally separated from other rhythmites, and that's not the case. Shaw and others postulate that the rapid draining of the ponded lake, while the groundwater head at depth in the sediments remained high, caused explosive release of water that formed the clastic dike. And finally, the 89 rhythmites in northeast Washington could not have been deposited by multiple Lake Missoula floods, as postulated by Atwater, because they do not contain any basaltic clasts. Floodwater from Lake Missoula flood would have had to traverse the northern edge of the Columbia River basalts and would have carried abundant basalt clasts if they flowed north up the Sandpool Valley. Since basalt clasts are not present, the rhythmites in Sandpool Valley are clearly deposited by water flowing south rather than north. Thus, the 89 rhythmites were not formed by multiple Lake Missoula floods, but most likely by melting pulses from the Cordilleran ice sheet to the north, perhaps triggered by sub-ice volcanic activity. These would be volcanoes erupting under the ice sheet. Now, a recent observation of catastrophic outburst floods in Iceland called Jökulhlaups provide further support for only one gigantic Lake Missoula flood. Water from snow melted by subglacial volcanic eruptions in Iceland burst from underneath the ice on November 5th, 1996, in one of the largest floods ever witnessed. The peak discharge was 45,000 cubic meters per second, which was only 0.2% of the peak discharge of the Lake Missoula flood. Iceland's Jökulá lasted for 36 hours, similar to the 48 hours posited for the Missoula flood. During the latter half of the flood, the water switched outlets, causing the original outlet to act as a slackwater embayment. Besides crossbeds in the slackwater embayment, planar beds dipping at low angles form many normally graded rhythmites of fine gravel and coarse sand. 200 planar rhythmites and 100 propagating rhythmites formed a section 15 meters thick in just 17 hours. That's one rhythmite every 3 to 4 minutes. Moreover, large rip-up class of bedded strata composed of stratified sand and gravel up to 3 meters in diameter were placed within the rhythmites. I have observed rip-up class in a number of Lake Missoula flood bars and slackwater deposits. Matrix-supported outsized class within the rhythmites are reminiscent of dropstone varvites. And these are enclaimed ancient Ice Age deposits. If that tiny Jökulá, which is actually the biggest ever witnessed, Iceland flood can produce 15 meters of rhythmites in a single flood in a short period of time, then the Lake Missoula flood can certainly form the amount of rhythmites that are observed along the edge of its flow path, with the maximum thickness at Burlingame Canyon of 50 meters. So there you have it. The Missoula flood was probably one single outburst flood, and there were other floods that were happening at the same time of much lesser value. But the main carving of all of the orange here, the channeled scablands, happened from one outburst flood, which was, tens of miles wide, moving at 65 miles an hour out to the Pacific. Absolutely mind-blowing. Now, there is a recent paper here, 2020, September 2020, the Missoula and Bonneville floods, a review of Ice Age mega floods in the Columbia River Basin. And this might help us understand a little bit of the dating. Now, radiocarbon dating of sparse organic materials in, obviously, the varvites or the varves. What are they calling them? I just forgot the name. Oh my goodness. Let's go back to the dating here. The radiocarbon dating of organic materials remains the key to defining flood chronology, but has been lately bolstered by analysis of terrestrial cosmogenic nucleotides and optically stimulated luminescence. VARV counts and paleomagnetic secular variation studies help to define durations and intervals represented by sequences of flood beds. The 16,000 kiloyear Mount St. Helens S. tephra is commonly interbedded with flood deposits, enabling correlation of deposits among sites. Tephra from the 13.7 to 13.4 kiloyear eruption of Glacier Peak overlies all glacial Lake Missoula and Missoula flood deposits, defining an end time. So the floods were over by 13,007 to 13,400 years ago, which is before the Younger Dryas event at 12.9. So these floods don't have anything to do with the Younger Dryas event, which I find fascinating because many people confuse them. They happened before the Younger Dryas event during the entire period of the Bowling-Alarod warming. Overall conclusions are that glacial Lake Missoula was extant and producing floods for about 3,000 years, between 20 and 14 kiloyears. At least 75 floods preceded Mount St. Helens, tephra, followed by 30 or more after the tephra. Now, these guys are using old data because the 30 or more after the tephra are probably just one flood. And so who knows how many floods preceded it, but it just may have been a few. And it's interesting how scientists don't get the memo of other people's research. That's the whole point of science. Going into the literature and finding all the information so that you can make the best decision as to what the reality is. Now, what is happening during the time of the Missoula floods? If, in fact, the Missoula floods do happen before the Younger Dryas event, what's happening is sea level is rising. But we don't have any huge catastrophic sea level rises until the end of the Younger Dryas at 11.5. When sea level, in just 500 years, and it could be much less because of the error and uncertainty, in just 500 years, sea level rises 20 meters globally. That's 60 feet. Any city that would have been coastal would be under deep water very quickly. And it may have happened in catastrophic pulses within meltwater pulse 1b. This is just like smooth data. You can see the data points here are the orange diamonds, the red pluses, magenta squares and circles. So the Younger Dryas climate event occurred during the middle of the last deglacial cycle and is marked by an abrupt shift in the North Atlantic polar front almost to its former glacial position, trending east to west. Using high precision and high accuracy uranium thorium dated Barbados reef crest corals at Chiropora palmata, that's the genus and species, they generated a detailed sea level record from 13.9 to 9,000 years before present, and reconstructed the ice volume response to the Younger Dryas cooling from the mid-Alarad to the end of the Younger Dryas at 11.65 here, they're dating it. Rates of sea level rise decreased smoothly from 20 millimeters per year to 4 millimeters per year, culminating in a 400-year slow stand before accelerating into meltwater pulse 1b. The meltwater pulse 1b event at Barbados is better constrained as beginning by 11.45 kiloyears and ending at 11.1. So it's only 400 years now dated in this paper using uranium thorium. And they propose that meltwater pulse 1b is a direct, albeit lagged, response of the northern hemisphere ice sheets to the rapid warming marking the end of the Younger Dryas, coinciding with rapid warming in the circum-North Atlantic region, and the polar front shift from its zonal to meridional position at 11.65 kiloyears. As predicted by glaciological models, the ice sheet response to rapid North Atlantic warming was lagged by 400 years due to the thermal inertia of large ice sheets. So, what say you? That sounds like a good idea. So all this thermal mass builds up and then it gets warmer and boom. The only way you can really raise sea level is through thermal expansion of the oceans. So you need to have the heat built into the oceans to allow it to rise. And there is often a lag time between it warming, and you can see here that little lag time of it warming before it starts to rise. And then we're off to the races. Sea level comes up 50 meters or more just in this graph from 14 to 9,000 years ago. That's 150 feet. Now, there may be other explanations to what's going on back at these events. And we'll get to that next week. And evidence for a solar flare as the cause of the Pleistocene mass extinction and the Younger Dryas event itself. So join us next week for another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe. And be safe. We love you.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.